India's power generation is predominantly fueled by coal, very high fossil level usage. And I think you can see that in the fact also that some 6 out of 10 of the most polluted cities in the world are Indian.
India's share of global emissions stands at about 7% today. It is a fair bit. So big economy that's growing, home to the second largest population in the world, but from a per capita perspective in terms of how much the country emits per person, the reality is the global average is 2.5 times what India is today.
What you will start to see in India with growing affluence is a increasing in the per capita carbon emissions. Therefore, I think India is a very important part of global decarbonization.
The two big nations, India and China, without them, we aren't going to get to where we want to get to by 2050. So it's absolutely critical that we work closely with both of them. We have this strong relationship with India already. We have the City of London Corporation has an office in Mumbai, has done for 8 to 10 years. That historical relationship is one that helps us.
India itself, of course, has pledged to reduce carbon emissions very significantly by some 35% by 2030, and with an allied reduction in carbon emissions across the industrial chain. And by 2030, you will start to see some quite dramatic changes in the Indian power generation mix, driven by a move towards renewables. Some 40% of Indian energy will be generated by renewables over the next 15 to 20 years.
The focus of the conversation till now was primarily on the energy transition. There's also the mobility transition, which is all about, well, how do you shift from internal combustion engine-based mobility to something that is non-polluting? Mobility is where solar was in India about 10 years ago. And remember, solar didn't take a long time to get from where it was 10 years ago, which was zero almost, to being 35, 40 gigawatt today. So if I were to give you numbers, EVs in India just crossed the 2% share of total vehicle sales in August this year. But of course, the ambition is much, much higher. And just in terms of an example, I'll give you a number which derives from Niti Aayog's ambition or vision of where they want to see electric mobility. Now, Niti Aayog is the premier think tank to the government of India, and they set out a mobility or electric mobility vision for India and sort of talked about where they think India should be, or they want to see India be by 2030. Their vision is that 80% of two-wheelers and three-wheelers would be electric by 2030, 70% of commercial vehicles would be electric, 40% of buses would be electric, and 30% of private vehicles, four-wheelers, would be electric. So sum it all up, it's a $206 billion sales opportunity in India over the next 10 years, if you were to go by Niti Aayog's vision.
So the move towards electrification is also a move towards metallification. All aspects of electrification, from power generation to storage to infrastructure to transmission, are extremely metal dependent. Battery storage requires very intensive usage of minerals such as lithium, cobalt, battery grade nickel. All of these are in fairly short supply because we've come through this sort of last 20 years of a period of significant underinvestment in minerals. And in addition, the projected levels of metal that we need for electrification are disproportionately large. For example, we as a race will probably use more copper in the next 15 years than mankind has ever used. Just in the context of India alone, India's projected lithium and cobalt usage for electric vehicles between now and 2030 is greater than the global production of those minerals today. So there has to be significant upstream investment in critical minerals, but also in ethically sourced and ethically mined minerals. Mines in countries which have higher ESG standards will attract more investment than those that don't.
Finance is really the piece that ties this whole thing together, because When you're talking about the transition, when you're talking about decarbonizing, you're really talking to a large extent by putting infrastructure on the ground, which will help the economy decarbonize. Heavy industry is another key core infrastructure sector, which is necessary to actually have India achieve its ambitions for economic growth. And amongst heavy industry, it's cement and steel which contribute the biggest share towards GHG emissions.
Heavy industry, which is primarily defined as steel, metallurgical industries, cement, have a different pathway to reducing high emissions, because very often it's not just the electricity usage, but the very nature of the process itself that leads to high emissions. Technology, for example, in the form of India moving away from blast furnaces towards electric arc furnaces, which run off recycled scrap and high-quality metallic feedstock, for instance, will bring as much as a 25 to 30% reduction in greenhouse emissions from that particular process. Similarly, within the cement industry, there's extraction and processing changes underway, which will make a difference.
What we're trying to do when we're talking about decarbonizing requires not just effort from one country or two countries, but requires effort and cooperation between countries. I think when it comes to the UK-India corridor or partnership, one of the ways in which practically this can work is in the area of finance.
Firstly, there's the CFLI, which is the Climate Finance Leadership Initiative India Partnership. And we've had conversations at government-to-government level, and we need to help. So that transition and that funding of that transition can't just come from India paying for it themselves. They wouldn't be able to afford it, and that is partly the task of developed countries to help with developed emerging countries. So we need to help India as much as we can, and whether it's through expertise, innovation, technology, lawyers, rule of law, everything is here, and this is our huge advantage versus the rest of the world.
One of the things that I've seen and what we've tracked is on the back of the pandemic, there's been a huge shift in interest amongst investors towards everything green, towards everything sustainable, and that's a big positive. For example, we tracked international green bond issuances towards the Indian renewable sector this year and found that in the first 6 months of 2021, more money was raised, to be precise, $3.5 billion, than in any previous calendar year. So that's really promising. But if you were to unpack that and see where the money came from, we saw about 50% of that actually came from Asia Pacific. About 25% of it came from North America, specifically the US. And only 25% of it came from EMEA. So I think there's a lot more that the UK can do from a private capital mobilization perspective, particularly London can do from a private capital mobilization perspective.
The City of London has had a long and very successful track record in establishing itself as a centre of mining finance. And I think what you're beginning to see now is the City of London working with a country like India to develop a number of different financing techniques, including differential pricing for ethically sourced minerals, a framework in which ethically constructed offtake agreements can work, financing for Indian companies, investing in British companies, especially in processing and extraction technologies, and finally, in the standards around green financing, which drive the differential pricing that makes green financing successful. Many of which are building incrementally on the expertise the City of London has built over the last 50 years.
Well, I mean, it's the green revolution. It's going to be bigger than the industrial revolution. We've got to move even quicker. And that green revolution is going to involve using minerals and metals that we don't have enough of. So that ethical mining element is also going to prove critical.
I think the kind of growth numbers that we've talked about, allied with the sort of transition that India is going through, also underpinned by two important strategic objectives that India has followed for the last few years, which is of developing new technologies within India and onshoring advanced production techniques within India, provide some extremely attractive investment opportunities all linked to decarbonisation over the next 20 to 30 years.
I always say it's about greening finance and financing green, and this is the future, and it's a great opportunity for the City of London to be the centre of green finance, and whether that's private and public finance coming together, which I think it very much will, but also the City of London being this financial centre where we have the capital to invest in some of those projects in India.